and welcome to our Minor White Honours Hall and the 14th V.N. Bhatia Lecture. This evening's lecture is sponsored jointly by the Honours College and the Visiting Writers Series in the Department of English. My name is Grant Norton, and I have the privilege to serve as Dean of the Honours College. The Bhatia Lectureship was established to honour the legacy of Dr. V.N. Bhatia, known to everyone in Pullman as Vic. Vic played an essential role, a pivotal role, in the establishment and development of an honours program, later to become an honours college at Washington State University. Vic serves as director of the honours program for over 28 years and built a program to such an extent that the New York Times reported the extent to which an honours student pursues a deeper and more far-ranging education is seen at Washington State University, where the honours program is widely regarded as one of the strongest in the country. Bhatia was extremely proud of the curriculum he developed and opportunities that an honours education provided for WSU students. Vic was quoted as saying, "The honours curriculum gives students an opportunity to look at knowledge and civilization in the broadest perspective. This lectureship and this evening's lecturer continue that commitment." It's my distinct privilege to introduce award-winning author, science journalist and reporter, Michelle Nijhuis. Michelle will discuss her latest book, Beloved Beasts Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction, which was published in March 2021. Michelle's book traces the modern conservation movement from the late 19th century to modern times through the lives and ideas of the people who built it. Its topics range from battles to save the American bison and bald eagle to the role of scientists and activists such as Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson, and from the origins of the Audubon Society and the World Wildlife Fund to efforts to protect the whooping crane and black rhinoceros. It further explores conservation efforts as impacted by racism and colonialism. Beloved Beasts won the Sierra Club's 2021 Rachel Carson Award, and it was selected by the Chicago Tribune as one of the 10 best books of 2021 and named the top 10 best science book of 2021 by both Booklist and Smithsonian Magazine. Please welcome Michelle Nijhuis.
Thank you so much, Dean Norton. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to Peter Chilson, who has so kindly hosted me for the last couple of days, and also to Debbie Lee, who I think is watching online and is in Chicago, but helped to plan my visit before she went on leave. So, and thanks to all of you for being here on a beautiful afternoon. I want to talk today about my journey through the history of the modern conservation movement and the perhaps surprising sense of hope and optimism that I gained from that journey. So let me make sure I have my controls set up. I think that there we go. I think that most of you are probably familiar with some of the more controversial species in our region, the desert tortoise, which I actually worked on years and years ago as a young biologist, the sage grouse, native to the Great Basin, the plains bison, and of course, the gray wolf. So we talk about species controversies over vulnerable species, and conflicts over endangered species. But of course, what we're really talking about are conflicts among humans about species. And I got a very up close and personal look at this early in my career when I was a biologist in training. If any of you are GIS specialists and recognize that device, that's what that was called a Trimble, and it was what we used to carry around instead of a cell phone to mark locations to mark locations of our study plots. We thought it was very cool at the time, but looks pretty outdated now. After I graduated from college with a biology degree in the 90s, I supported myself for a couple of years as an itinerant field biologist, and I loved these jobs because they introduced me to a lot of amazing landscapes. But what was surprising and disturbing, but also fascinating, was the close look I got at some of these really bitter and even violent conflicts over vulnerable species like the desert tortoise. And what struck me about these conflicts, well, a lot of things, but what I took with me from watching those conflicts unfold was that even people who were on the same side or ostensibly on the same side were in disagreement over why we should protect a species, or why we were protecting one species and not another, or who exactly should bear the cost of protecting a species. These very fundamental questions were things that people in the room, even people who, as I said, ostensibly agreed with one another, didn't have any basic agreement upon. And so after I became a journalist and started to cover these conflicts as a journalist, and I continued to see the same thing unfold, where people would kind of get stuck in this, why are we doing this phase, and start asking each other questions that, of course, couldn't be resolved in the course of any one public meeting, I started to think, well, certainly people from the past, and I know that, intelligent people from the past have tackled these questions and come up with some answers. But like most people interested in conservation, even though I knew some names of conservation icons, I really didn't have a sense of how conservation had developed as a movement, had developed as a tradition and an accumulation of ideas. And so almost for my own satisfaction, I started to think, well, would it be possible to put that story together in a single narrative and really look at how some of the answers to these profound questions that people are obviously still needing to know the answer to have developed over time. And after many years, I'm skipping over about 25 years here, but between the picture on the left and the picture on the right, but that became my book, Beloved Beasts, which came out last year. And the first of many challenges in trying to tell the story of a global movement in a way that would be accessible to not only professionals in the field, but to people who were just generally interested in conservation, was to decide where the modern conservation began. And it turns out it kind of begins with Alice in Wonderland. And the reason for that is that I think for reasons that I hope will either be obvious or become obvious, I wanted to differentiate it from the kinds of conservation that people have practiced for millennia on a local level. And I wanted to talk about the development of the conservation movement as a movement. And to me, that began in industrialized societies in Europe and North America, when people first realized that it was possible for humans to drive species extinct. Now, most people didn't even realize it was possible to drive for any species to go extinct until about 1800. For a long time, European intellectuals thought, well, species are just created by God. They don't change and they don't go away, and what's here is what's always been here. And in about 1800, they finally realized, some of these, monsters we're finding the bones of in the ground are species that they were once with us and are no longer with us. But it took until the mid-1800s, after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, that people finally grasped the idea that, humans actually, we seem like this puny species, but we are capable of driving entire species extinct, not only by our direct actions, but indirectly as part of our consumer decisions and so forth, because that, of course, drives international trade. And species like the dodo had gone extinct a couple of hundred years ago, but it took quite a long time for people to put together the fact that the dodo had been driven extinct by sailors searching for trade routes from Asia to Europe. And when they had landed on the island of Mauritius, they had brought with them cats and rats and other predators that the dodos hadn't been exposed to, and which made quick work of the dodos. So to me, the signal event in the acceptance of the idea that people could drive other species extinct, globally extinct, is the fact that when Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, he inserted himself into the narrative as this giant talking dodo. And then in the decades that followed, people came around to the idea that even physically very large, famously abundant species like the American bison could also be driven extinct by human activities. And when it became clear in the late 1800s that commercial hunting, to meet demand from European and North American customers for hides, was in fact driving this famously abundant species extinct, one of the reactions was resignation. Oh, well, okay, yes, this is true, we have done it, but perhaps this is also the price of progress. And there were newspaper editorials to this effect. And it took the first generation of conservationists like this fellow William Hornaday in the black suit and the stick, to say, not only is it not inevitable, but we have a moral responsibility to prevent it from happening. And William Hornaday, who was the director of the Bronx Zoo and a very flawed but fascinating character, took it upon himself to try to raise a group of bison in the Bronx. He basically raised them like cows, put them on a train, and send them out to the grasslands of Oklahoma, where they thrived. And the descendants of those bison are still members of the federal herds that are being used to continue the restoration of bison today. So that was the beginning of my story. And the way I found my way through this very complicated history, or I couldn't hope to tell the whole story, but the way I represented it was to follow the lives and careers of about a dozen people who I saw as especially important to the conservation movement, in the sense that they either brought about or were present at certain turning points in the history of the conservation movement up until the present day. So I started with William Hornaday and his little bison calf there, and followed the overlapping lives and careers of many of these folks. And one of the most satisfying parts of this process was to not only understand some figures who I thought I knew well, like Rachel Carson here on the lower left, Aldo Leopold up on the upper row, but to see how they had interacted with other conservationists, famous and not so famous, and disagreed, sometimes exchanged snippy letters, sometimes argued with one another, sometimes indirectly influenced one another, but that they had accumulated knowledge and thinking over time. And that was one of the sources of my sense of, I wouldn't say unalloyed optimism, but a certain sense of hope that I took from this project, that we have made progress and accumulated knowledge over time. So after walking alongside these folks for quite a while, I feel qualified to make a few generalizations, and keep in mind these are generalizations. The accomplishments of the conservation movement that I see are first and foremost that conservationists managed to prevent the extinction of many species we enjoy and appreciate today. And I think it's so easy to forget that, because conservationists in general, I mentioned that most conservationists aren't really familiar with their own history. I think that is because they're often focused on the emergency confronting them. So they're not taking time to look back and look at the tragedies that have been prevented. But those are significant. Were it not for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, for instance, we wouldn't have many songbirds that we appreciate today, because there was essentially no protection for songbirds in North America at the beginning of the 1900s, and many of them were going extinct because of plume hunters, and it was because of conservationists that we have those protections today, still one of the strongest environmental laws we have. Raised and sustained public concern about other species. As I said, when the conservation movement began, a lot of people were unfamiliar with the idea of human-caused extinction. Some people weren't quite fully accepting of its reality. And I think the fact that it's easy to take for granted the fact that most of us have at least a working knowledge of the concept of extinction, that the possibility that it can happen, and that it's a pretty bad thing. That is due, I think, to the efforts of the conservation movement. Created institutions capable of working across political boundaries. This is something that doesn't get appreciated a lot, but I think in our global economy and given the reality of other species, which, as we know, humans are the only species that voluntarily obeys political boundaries. Many species their ranges cross political boundaries, individuals cross political boundaries. So you need institutions that can also cross those boundaries and cooperate in the protection of species across their range, not just part of their one population that's part of a larger whole. And finally, evolved from an effort to prevent extinction to an effort to protect relationships. This was something that only became clear to me as I read more and more about the history of conservation. When William Hornaday brought the bison back to Oklahoma, when the species was almost extinct, it was extinct in the wild, he, as I said, basically raised cows like livestock, and raised bison like cows. And his concern was to make sure there were some living bison left on the grasslands, but the science of ecology was very young. Hornaday himself wasn't an ecologist. And so he didn't have a sense that we do now, that the bison are very important to the prairie ecosystem. They have relationships with all sorts of different species, plant and animal, and that their reintroduction is about a lot more than just a few healthy bison on the ground. And I think that while I'm sure many of you get direct mail appeals from conservation organizations with, a single charismatic species meant to, inspire your generosity, I think conservation professionals do know it's about much more. It is about protecting those species, of course, but it's really about protecting the relationships between those species, between not so charismatic species, and between assemblages of species and their habitats. Now, as for the failures and oversights of the conservation movement, I'm being a little hard on Teddy Roosevelt here, but this was a picture. This, to me, kind of encapsulates the preoccupations of the early conservation movement, because this is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt kitted out in his full buckskin in his pre-presidential days, but the photo was taken in a studio in New York. So the first generation of conservationists were, for the most part, elite sport hunters, wealthy white men, mostly North American, and they were incredibly prescient. As I said about William Hornaday, these were men who stepped forward and said, humanity's never confronted this problem before, but we're causing this global extinction and we can stop it. So they were very prescient about that, but they had several blind spots, and one of the most damaging, I think, in the long term was that they, even though they were sport hunters themselves, they were really dismissive of the conservation knowledge or expertise or accumulated practices of subsistence hunters and, by extension, subsistence farmers. And in fact, people like William Hornaday often saw subsistence hunters as part of the problem, part of one of the enemies of wildlife that wildlife needed to be protected from. And in some cases that might have been true, but in most cases there was a bank of knowledge about how to live sustainably from year to year alongside a population of game animals that these early conservationists more or less ignored. And that, to me, one of the effects of that that we still see today in the conservation movement is a reliance on top-down solutions. So on passing national laws, on establishing park and reserve boundaries, and those things are extremely important. As I just said, without the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, there are many songbird populations we would not have today. Without our parks and reserves, there are many landscapes and probably many species we would not have today. But I think it's become clear to recent generations that those solutions cannot be our only strategies if we want to protect species and habitats on a meaningful scale, because you can only draw boundaries around so many things, and you can only defend boundaries to a certain extent. Every boundary is porous, so you really need the support of people who live alongside species to, as I said, practice ways of living that help protect those populations for the long term. And the third oversight I see, or the third consequence of these blind spots, is that it reinforced this conceptual and literal separation of people and nature. I think the conservation movement still sends the message that their primary purpose is to protect nature from people, rather than to support people in living alongside nature. And of course, there are many cases in which nature really does need to be protected from people, especially considering the damage our species has already done. But the fact that we can and need to play a positive role in species conservation is often discounted, and I think really to the detriment of both people and wildlife. And when the conservation movement went international in the 1960s and started working with colonial governments in order to establish national parks and reserves in colonized territory, the weak points of the strategy really became clear, because if a park was established in a place without much knowledge of what was already going on there, what practices were already in place to protect the local wildlife, often those practices were disrupted, people were dispossessed of their land, and suddenly, this wasn't good for wildlife either, because suddenly these new parks were surrounded by hostile people who weren't that, were no longer interested in, often in protecting the populations of species that were no longer available to support them. And I think this bias toward top-down solutions continues to make many people in the conservation movement susceptible to incomplete ideas like the tragedy of the commons, which I was speaking about with a class this afternoon. Many of you, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the phrase tragedy of the commons. Some of you may know its origin. It was made famous by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin, who published an essay about the tragedy of the commons in Science in 1968. And the argument of the tragedy of the commons is that unless shared resources are privatized or controlled by some kind of external authority like a state government, quote unquote tragedy is inevitable. So people will pursue their individual gain to the detriment of the resource. They will use up the resource as they are focused on their individual benefit. Continues to be one of the journal's most cited and most requested papers. And it's still often taught uncritically in college and university classes. And I know from anecdotally that I still, probably on a monthly basis, I hear a conservationist invoke the tragedy of the commons uncritically, as if it's something that we have to deal with as a species, a weakness in our species that we have to deal with. And so the tragedy of the commons, I think the reason for the stickiness of this idea, or at least one of the reasons, is that it feels inevitable to all of us because we see it all the time. We know many examples from history. This is a photo of bison skulls piled up at a fertilizer plant in Michigan in the late 1800s when the species was almost extinct. So these are commercial hunters pursuing their individual gain despite the onrushing tragedy of the commons. And then there's also the tragedy of the shared refrigerator that everyone is familiar with, I'm sure, from either your current college days or your past college days. A refrigerator is a commons, a highway is a commons if you've been stuck in a traffic jam, a public toilet is a commons if you've been in a dirty public toilet lately. So we see these tragedies, large and small, all the time. And I think when Garrett Hardin published his essay, which was not based on data, but on his assumptions about human nature, a lot of people said, oh, yeah, that must be inevitable because I see it all the time. And, there are days when I think it must be inevitable too. But the truth is that it's not. And many of you may have heard the name Elinor Ostrom, but probably not as many of you as have heard the phrase tragedy of the commons, unfortunately, because Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist who, when the Tragedy of the Commons paper was published, had been studying a group of groundwater users in Los Angeles who had come up with a pretty innovative way of managing what was a very precious resource in arid Southern California. And they had done it without state intervention and without privatizing the groundwater resource. And it was not a beautiful, elegant, simple solution. It was quite a complicated, layered solution, but it worked. And so when she read The Tragedy of the Commons, she thought, well, I've already seen evidence that this isn't as inevitable as Garrett Hardin is arguing. And she did carry on a several decades long correspondence with Garrett Hardin, and once had him over to dinner and served him hamburger helper. So this was I think a passionate but civil academic debate. She devoted most of the rest of her career to looking at and analyzing examples of communities that had successfully managed whatever their shared resource was, whether it was a fishery, a forest, a pasture, a wildlife population. She found examples, many of which had been studied already. She found anecdotal reports. She visited some herself and did fieldwork. And she and her colleagues and students analyzed about 5,000 examples and picked out what they saw as the most important common features of the successful communities. And now some of these systems have go back centuries. So in one case, there's one that's 1,000 years old. And so they really wanted to unlock the secrets of their success. And what they found is that successful commons, no matter what their size or location or resource, tend to have clear rules and consequences. People who are part of them know what the rules are, and they know that if they cheat the system, there will be consequences, and there will be more serious consequences for chronic cheaters. These common systems have good relationships with other levels of authority, so with household heads as well as with state and federal governments. And importantly, to Elinor Ostrom, they are not panaceas. She was always very insistent that her work not be interpreted as a toppling of the tragedy of the commons idea. She would say, well, this is just, as the first slide I showed of her says, this is the part that we've ignored is what citizens can do. This is a missing piece. Sure, sometimes privatization is necessary. Sometimes state intervention is necessary. But where Garrett Hardin was wrong is in arguing that those things are one or the other is always necessary. And what we know from our research, our actual data rather than our opinion, is that this can work, and it can work for centuries, given these important characteristics. So I really like this observation of hers that we're neither trapped in inexorable tragedies nor free of moral responsibility. So inaction leads to a tragedy of the commons. That's where inertia takes us. But if people take the moral responsibility to figure out an alternative, those alternatives can work. And I got a chance to see this in action as part of my book research when I went to Namibia in southern Africa. And I got to see a nationwide network of community conservancies in action. And these were in part inspired by Elinor Ostrom's work, because in the 1980s, when her work was emerging, at the same time, a loose group of scholars and community leaders and conservationists in Southern Africa was recognizing, like, this top-down method of conservation is really, it's not working for anybody. We need to somehow restore this relationship between ordinary people and the wildlife they live alongside. How can we facilitate that? And so Ostrom's work fed into that and gave people confidence that these community conservancy models that followed Ostrom's rules had a chance at doing this. And so the community conservancy system in Namibia grew in a very grassroots way, really from from a series of kitchen table conversations between conservationists and local people about what local people needed from wildlife management and what they, the role they saw for themselves in wildlife management. And as I said, it's now a nationwide system that has returned a lot of substantive power, substantive management authority to these local communities, which are self-governed, and they assist in the surveying of local game populations. They set their own hunting quotas, and they are able to, as a community, they're able to benefit from tourism related to healthy wildlife populations. And so the benefits and burdens of conservation have been shifted a little bit. They haven't made anyone rich, but they've shifted a little bit so that people are willing to make the commitment needed to steward those populations. And it was quite a powerful experience for me to go to a general meeting, much like the one on the lower right-hand corner, where people were arguing about what are we gonna set as a hunting quota this year. There was a big debate about, there was a drought year and some zebras had been they had set up a water source for some zebras, but a human family had been taking water from that same water source, and there was a big philosophical debate over whether that constituted poaching or not, which I thought was really interesting. Nobody answered the question, but so there was a lot of surface argument, but there was a fundamental agreement that yes, we're all in support of protecting these species. We know why it's important, and we are committed to putting the time in. And so this model, this community-led conservation model that's inspired in part by Elinor Ostrom's work and then just inspired by traditional conservation practices around the world, has become a thriving international movement that's actually a lot better known outside North America than within it. The Namibian conservancies have restored the black rhino populations in northern Namibia and the elephant populations, which at one point were both of which were close to extinction. They've done a remarkable job of protecting black rhino populations in the area from the continent-wide epidemic of poaching that is still occurring throughout southern Africa and elsewhere on the continent. And community-led conservation is also thriving in Southeast Asia, in Australia. Canada has made a big national investment in the indigenous-led management of some of its national parks, and we're starting to see some here in the US as well. So some of you probably recognize this guy, Aldo Leopold, author of a Sound County Almanac. I have been a Leopold fan for a long time, but I really enjoyed the chance to get to know him a little bit better through my book research. His archives are beautifully preserved digitally and physically at the University of Wisconsin. And one of the things that one of the writings of his that I was not familiar with was a lecture that he gave in 1934 when the dust storms were first escaping from the Dust Bowl and starting to blow across the continent and really shocking people with their power and waking them up to what I think must have seemed as apocalyptic to them at the time as climate change does to us. So Aldo Leopold gave a speech at the new University of Wisconsin Arboretum. He was a professor there at the time, and he was a very measured person, and this is an unusually snarky speech. I can only think that he was really exercised about the Dust Bowl. But I love what he says here, which is there's a feeble minority called conservationists who are just beginning to realize that their task involves the reorganization of society rather than the passage of some fish and game laws. It's kind of a mean quote, but it's a good point, and I think it's still true today because the passage of fish and game laws was hard fought and really important. The establishment of national parks, same thing. But really, conservation, meaningful conservation, is about a reorganization of society, I think, a transfer of some of the power that's now held at the top to the grassroots level, and which I think is proven to have the potential to restore and adapt some traditional conservation practices that have been in place, have a much longer history than the conservation movement itself. I was at a conference last week where I heard a man from the Shawnee Nation say, We've been at this for 19,000 years. We've made a lot of mistakes. You can learn from those mistakes. And I think that's a great way of putting it. There's just a wealth of experience, bad and good, that is available to us today. And so I hope, and I think we're starting to see that this community-led conservation model, in concert with the structures, the conservation authorities that we already have in place, can be part of this reorganization of society in North America. And I think our job, people who are interested in conservation, people who want to see the survival and flourishing of other species, I think our job is to continue to restore what I've come to think of as the conservation ecosystem, and which I think has been missing a level for a long time. And I think the more we can do to restore that level, to learn from its experiences, and to integrate it into some of the good work of the modern conservation movement, the better job we can do of protecting the ecosystems that we all depend on. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
So the presentation is open for questions. Maybe I can start with a question. So you said that you've been to Namibia as one of the places you visited. Where else did you visit to get the research done?
Let's see. I spent quite a bit of time in Montana learning about the bison history. A little bit of time in New York, diving into Audubon Society archives, and I got to know, through the archives, got to know a great conservationist named Rosalie Edge, who had really created headaches for the Audubon Society in the 1920s. Got to read her persnickety letters. I traveled to Wisconsin to Alva Leopold Shack, and spent a bunch of time in Virginia with a ecologist practicing today who's originally from Ghana and now teaches fisheries science teaches conservation biology and fisheries science and champions the protection of common species. So those are some of the trips I took. And then of course my reporting over the years in different places fed into the book.
Yeah.
So. Yes.
We're so wrapped up in this region and debates around salmon and lamprey eels and the river systems, and I'm wondering from your research if you've come across models of really getting around the economic issues that are often tied up in conservation. It's one thing to empower communities, but how do you sort out really big economic interests that are part of that mix as well, and intractable?
And intractable, yes. Great question. And I don't have an easy answer for you, except, I mean, I can give you one example, and that is I'm really interested in an effort among tribes on the upper Columbia to organize themselves into, there's something called the Buffalo Treaty, which is an intertribal agreement among tribes in Montana and southern Canada, committing them to restoration of the bison on an ecosystem level. And that's an agreement among tribes that, you know, some historically have disagreements with each other going back a long way. It took a lot of negotiation to reach, even though it's not a binding agreement. So there's an effort to create a salmon treaty among salmon people of the upper Columbia. And the long-term goal of that is to give the tribes collectively a larger seat at the table and more muscle in the renegotiation of the Columbia Basin Treaty between the U.S. and Canada. So, and by doing so, to have some of the money that's available for salmon restoration in the basin to go to the tribes rather than to state or federal authorities. So I think that's one way I see of giving communities some power in their negotiations or conversations with big economic muscle that still, of course, wields a lot of power. But it's a long-term battle, and every situation is, of course, different. Yeah. And I will say, just in addition to one of those things, that, it doesn't, the community model does not, of course, make a dent in corporate power. But what people saw in Namibia was that it is, in many subtle but powerful ways, very empowering to the communities. And so, for instance, there was a corporate dam project proposed for northern Namibia, and the communities organized against that, and the national government, which had been supportive of the project, eventually, dropped its agreement recognized the impacts it would have locally, and dropped its agreement with the dam company. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. One of the points that interested me about your talk was early on when you were talking about the evolution of consciousness about the impact of humans on animal extinction.
Mm-hmm.
And that first it wasn't noticed at all, and then it was noticed, but it must just be inevitable, and then humans have something to do with that. Human
Mm-hmm.
action, which could be changed, has something to do with that, which really for me had echoes of where we are right now with climate change. So I'm wondering, because right now I think, I hope, I don't know anybody who says, human action has nothing to do with the fate of other species.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there are people who think that, but that's not something that I'm aware of. So I'm wondering, what did you notice in tracing that evolution that were the change points that began moving that lever toward public acceptance that, human action does have something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Human action could be changed to do something.
I think, unfortunately, and this doesn't bode well for our conversation about climate change. Well, perhaps it does at the point we're at, but I think it was a close look at the impacts, because for many centuries, there were tons of bird extinctions brought about on small islands by indigenous people, as well as by explorers from North America and Europe. But they were not really taken seriously. People didn't, even though they were global extinctions, sometimes these island endemics, they were not taken very seriously, and people didn't really think, that of course that's the human's fault. That's because we brought a predator here or whatever. But when the great auk started to go extinct in the North Pacific because they'd had been hunted too much for eggs and feathers, and then when the bison started to decline, when the passenger pigeons started to decline, those were visible impacts that could be connected directly with overhunting, something that people knew was going on and had witnessed or seen pictures of. And so then they were able to look back and say, this has actually been going on a long time. We just haven't connected the dots. We haven't connected, the indirect effects of our consumer decisions and so forth. So yeah, I really think it took unfortunately, a live demonstration of the impacts to convince people that this was a real thing. And one other parallel that I see between the two is that I've talked to people who don't give credence to the human role in climate change from a religious perspective, and often the argument is, well, it's arrogant to believe that we humans could have such an impact on God's creation. And I think there might have been some of that too. It took Darwin to say, you're not as powerful as you think. You're not divine, but you are more powerful than you think in other ways. So. Other questions? Yeah, Peter.
So I was just curious about your trip to Namibia.
Yeah.
So when you went there, I was just wondering how you were received by the government. Was there any attempt to manage your visit? Were they concerned about the questions you were asking?
I did not meet the government.
Really?
Yeah, probably the highest level of government I met, other than the visa folks at the airport, were community conservancies. So there was no, I mean, as far as they were concerned, I was there as a tourist as well.
Okay.
So it's quite, I mean, it's a very, as you know, it's a pretty remote country. This was in northern Namibia, where there was, you know, the population is just scattered over this vast desert. So no one cared. But I think that had I been required to get a journalist visa, or had I been required to get some sort of official permission, I think the government that is in place now is extremely supportive of the community conservancy system. So
Okay.
would have seen it as good news, a good news story. Yeah. Why do you ask? I'm curious.
Just past experience, I'm always curious with the experience of others are dealing with minders,
Yeah.
and whether they were trying to control your interaction with these conservancies.
Yeah, no, fortunately. But I hooked up with people who knew the conservancies well and were able to introduce me. So, yeah.
You described yourself as a lapsed biologist. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to know a little bit about maybe what that means to you and how you got transitioned from field work to science writing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a joke, partly because I was never really a biologist. I was a biology major, and then I worked on field projects for a few years, and realized that while I was very interested in science, I wanted to more continue learning about it than actually do it myself. I really enjoyed hearing about scientist experiences and trying to understand, you know, how science worked and what made science tick. All those things were very intriguing to me, but I couldn't decide what to specialize in, and eventually I realized that was because I didn't really want to specialize in anything. And so journalism, writing about science as a journalist, was a perfect sort of marriage of those interests. Yeah.
This kind of ties in with the question about the growing awareness of human impact on
Mhm.
species. You mentioned the example of Alice in Wonderland, and I'm wondering if there were other popular stories or literature where you see these glimmers of kind of awareness coming to the forefront.
Yeah, in fact, in the Victorian age, it was quite a, fad is the wrong word, but there was definitely a popular preoccupation with extinction, and the idea of, once people realized it, they were very sort of saddened by it, and in a way inspired by it. I mean, there's a very weird children's book that came out about the same time as Alice in Wonderland, and it talks about the extinction of the great auk, and the main character, who is a child, has an encounter with the last great auk, kind of a traumatic children's story. But yeah, I think that I would love to read a study that someone did of popular fiction and children's literature at the time, because I bet there would be many, many more examples of that.
Yeah.
Michelle, I just have a question about, you know, the keys
Mm-hmm.
and just the process of writing the book. So what was the process? I mean, there must have been a lot of research that you had conducted. So what was the process that you followed? And then what is the one thing that you learned through the process of writing the book that maybe you didn't know before?
About writing itself, about myself. Well, many things. I don't think, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, but while there are many wonderful biographies of conservationists that put their work in context, I don't think there's any book that really tries to do what I have attempted to do in this book, which is, you know, knit the movement together and tell its story. And so once I you know, talked my way into a book contract and started to write the project, I thought, oh my gosh, there's a reason why no book like this exists, because it may in fact be impossible. And so I think just once I realized, okay, I'm going to follow the careers of these people who I do see as significant and use that as my map through the movement and tell the story that way, then I was able, that gave me a path through what is a very, I mean, I think and believe I've represented its major chapters fairly, but this is a movement that, of course, has so many threads, so many origin points, and, now is more diverse than ever, that this is nowhere near the complete story. I just hope it tells the essentials and gives people a place to start. So I don't know, what did I learn about myself? I think I learned once again what I have always learned in journalism, which is that there's always going to be a point in a project where you think it's not possible, and then that stage will pass. And so I think learning once again to have that kind of faith in a larger, more complicated process was something I'll take with me. So I don't think, for those of you who are students and perhaps writers, the fear and doubt never quite goes away, but you do get used to it. And you do learn to recognize it for what it is, which is probably old habits, and you do, I think, acquire some faith that, as I said, it will pass.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.